All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And I'll say welcome. My name is Greg Pierce. I am the Senior Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, Professor in Urban Planning at UCLA. My privilege to be moderating our webinar today on streamlining home electrification and particularly focusing on strategies to reach disadvantaged communities. We only have an hour here, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. First of all, note that the Luskin Center for Innovation is within the School of Public Affairs at UCLA, and this webinar is really in line with our mission to advance effective and equitable solutions to pressing environmental challenges through actionable research that's engaged with partners such as are featured on this webinar. Also want to thank you to our partners on this webinar and on some of the research that you hear about on the webinar, namely Valley Clean Air Now, who helped us put together today's discussion, as well as the Gateway Cities Council of Governments in Southeast Los Angeles, who sponsored the research you'll hear a little bit more about. Our agenda is on the screen, as you can see. I will quickly turn over the mic to our guest speaker to make opening remarks. After that, you'll hear from Lauren Dunlap to make a short research presentation around some of our work on building electrification, streamlining in disadvantaged communities. Then we'll spend about half of our time in a panel discussion with various folks who are experts in working in different facets of this issue. And then we should have time for Q&A based on questions that you all submit using the Q&A function of this webinar. And I believe the next slide lets you know how to do that. Essentially, you want to use the Q&A toolbar at the bottom, not the chat function. In addition to being able to put in your own questions, you can also upvote questions. And then we will be selecting likely a subset of questions that we're able to answer in the Q&A at the end. So that's the plan for today. And with that, I want to introduce Cliff Rechtschaffen to make opening remarks. Cliff is currently a board member of the California Air Resources Board and a senior advisor with the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU Law School. He's also an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley School of Law. You may also know him from his recent positions with the CPUC until 2023, and before that, just prior to that, as a senior advisor on climate and energy issues for Jerry Brown. And the governor's office, of course, has more experience preceding and adjacent to that. But with that, I want to turn it over to Cliff to get us oriented on this issue. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Greg. A pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Luskin Center for this research in this webinar. Home electrification is critical to meeting our climate and clean energy goals. It makes our air and homes much healthier. We can't lose sight of that. And it saves energy costs, and that is especially critical to low-income households who spend a disproportionate share of their income on utility costs. And we know that there is an enormous affordability challenge facing us right now. Unfortunately, we haven't made nearly enough progress in this area, and especially for low and moderate income customers. We know there's a lot of barriers to getting low income customers to electrify. We've been identifying them for years. Some are lack of awareness, some are financial, some are high upfront costs, some are permitting, but a lot relate to barriers in participating to the programs we have. We unfortunately have a lot of programs, a lot of entities involved, a lot of funding sources, a lot of agencies. We have complicated application and eligibility requirements, which are not uniform. We have challenges with coordination. We have a lack of trust and understanding with the providers. So we need to make it easier for low-income customers to participate in the programs we have. And the report that the Luskin Center authored shows that there are clear and available solutions for doing this. And as you'll hear more about in this next hour, the report discusses the results of this innovative Gateway Council of Governments pilot project. And I just want to take a moment to shout out my former CARB colleague and Gateway Cities COG Executive Director, Hector De La Torre, for making this happen. So what will we hear? Well, what are some of the lessons? Well, one-stop shop is key. You'll hear that word a lot. Can we align and streamlining our application process and our qualification process? Can we tailor outreach in a way that we build trust among participants? It's really critical, and I'm so happy to see this report talk about that, how much of a difference it makes to have a trusted, knowledgeable, and proactive and in-person, a real person, not an AI, not a bot, case manager who's hands-on facilitating all the details for customers across programs, across actors, private sector, public sector, planning, electricians and building and so forth. The reporter will also talk about how it'd be nice and helpful to have a universal home assessment process. And I think it'll talk about, I don't know how much we're going to get into in this next hour. More money is needed. More money is nice. The higher level of rebates allowed for a comprehensive, holistic approach to this program, and more money is always helpful. So with all of these features in place, applications and the pilots were approved faster, more projects were completed, customers were happier, they leave more motivated, more interested in participating in the future. So what are the big takeaways for me? It's time to press the go button. I mean, these barriers have been known for a while. As I said, the solutions aren't novel. That doesn't mean they're easy, but we're showing how they work effectively. There's a similar effort up in the Bay Area with PG&E and the Bayview Hunters Point program in the San Francisco Department of Environment. But what we've done here, the Gateway COG pilot, is proof of concept. Now's the time to accelerate these efforts. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. And you set us up perfectly for the rest of this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to my colleague, Project Manager of Energy Equity, Lauren Dunlap, to walk us through some of the highlights and lessons learned from this particular piece of research that Cliff was just talking about, and then set us up for a conversation in the broader space. So Lauren, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Cliff and Greg, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm just going to kind of jump right off from where Cliff left off, going more into the study details, and I'm really excited to share this with you. It was a fun project. So we recently put this report out. For a bit of background, a lot of the barriers that Cliff brought up were central in this work. So, as much as home electrification is a very important strategy for climate mitigation, home health, et cetera, and particularly crucial for low-income households and disadvantaged communities, there's also a ton of barriers that households face. High upfront costs are one of the big ones we hear about, but also the administrative burden of applying to a bunch of different programs. Sometimes those programs might not fully cover all of the upgrades that are needed. There's also a lot of misinformation and distrust out there about these things, and all of these barriers particularly do affect low-income households. And so one of the key barriers we were focusing on here, and that this program focused on, is the need for retrofits and upgrades and repairs to the home, even before the electrification can happen. And so one of the issues that presents is that when programs don't bring in a contractor early on in the program, sometimes households will learn that they need these pretty substantial retrofits with a lot of nuance and, somebody coming into their home and, everyone knows how fun a renovation can be. So getting that done earlier in the process should help to alleviate that barrier for people. They can, make sure they apply for the right programs, get the right types of funding. So we evaluated a pilot program in the gateway cities area of LA County, which is a region with in particular environmental burden, highways cutting through, and then also suspected lower electrification rates. So yeah, let me get into it. So the community contractor pilot program from 2025, there was an additional pot of money that was used to create this pilot program that's in addition to a pre-existing SoCal Edison program called Charge Ready Home. And Charge Ready Home provides rebates for electrical panel upgrades in single-family homes based on either disadvantaged community status, geographic status, or income qualifications, as shown here on the screen. And that's a Southern California Edison-funded program. So the community contractor pilot program took this additional funding stream from SoCal REN that through the Gateway COG that provided an up to additional $800 for these households, specifically for an electrician to come in, do a home assessment, and help decide sort of what upgrades make sense, what's feasible, what repairs are needed, and how much that all will cost. And so together, these rebates added up to $5,000 per household, which even though that might seem like a small difference, 5,000 versus 4,200, like percentage-wise, it really brings people a lot closer to the number that's often needed for these retrofits, even if it doesn't always quite still get all the way there. So our study wanted to evaluate this pilot and the strategies being used to see how well they can address some of the barriers we talked about. So we did a case study of this pilot in particular, and then we also did interviews with 12 experts and practitioners from a wide array of spaces, utility, labor, policy, some of whom are here today on our panel and some of whom are here today in our audience. So thank you all so much for joining. Through both some prior knowledge and also our case study and interviews, we found these were some of the major barriers to home electrification. So definitely many of these are things Cliff mentioned. Complex application processes, eligibility verification processes. That was a really common one that came up. Including that sometimes programs will have different eligibility processes and different application processes. And so then if a household might be eligible for multiple programs, they still have to go through separate processes to apply for those. Also, like I mentioned, home retrofit requirements, including a lot of work that isn't electrical. So you might think, oh yeah, there's an electrical panel upgrade needed, but that also includes, things that go beyond that electrical work. There's also a lot of distrust and misinformation that gets in the way of these things that came up in many of our interviews. Of course, financial barriers, you always hear about this, but it really does obviously take center stage a lot of the time. So both in terms of the upfront costs, but also households don't know how electrification is going to affect their bills, right? Like they know that it may make their electricity bill go up. They may or may not be aware of how much it will bring down their gas bill, including maybe getting rid of their gas bill. And like they don't know necessarily how that will balance out. And that can be very nerve-wracking for folks. There's also just kind of general challenges with coordination and permitting that can lead to longer timelines and just sort of additional administrative burden and confusion along the way. Now, nevertheless, throughout 2025, the community contractor pilot led to a total of $172,200 of rebates going to 44 households. And the average annual income of these households was about $55,000. And if you look in our report, there's a lot more detail about the, demographics of the area, the demographics of the county and the state. But that is a substantially lower income than the average for the area or for the county. This program had a lot of successes through the extra $800 targeted at these home assessments. By bringing that funding up to a total of up to $5,000 per household, it effectively turned the rebate into a direct install program. All of that money, the contractor actually is able to do the work without the household having to pay anything. And then the contractor gets reimbursed through the rebate. And that eliminates the need for a household to put any money out of pocket until the very end. And if at the very end, it's something that they've agreed on with the contractor and they know that it's going to go above that $5,000 threshold and they still proceed. And that isn't a super common outcome that happened in this case. It also really demonstrated how powerful the case management approach is, or as Cliff mentioned, the sort of one-stop shop approach. Essentially, the power of this is that the program provides case managers who work one-on-one with customers. They sit down from the very beginning and say, okay, what are you interested in? What are you qualified for? And they take their documentation, they help organize from the household to the contractor to say, what photos are needed of this person's house, and they go and help take the photos or help the household member take the photos, and then work across both the contractor and the customer, and also the permitting agencies, the utility doing the meter spot. All of these different people who are involved, that case manager can coordinate, which is a huge burden lifted off of the person or household applying for the program. And throughout the pilot program, the case managers at Street Level Strategy, they not only kind of did all of that, but they also were observing throughout the process how different roadblocks would pop up, and they rolled out continuous changes to the program. And through that, they were able to really facilitate the program speeding up. So there's a lot more detail about this in our report, so I'll just show this very briefly to show this is a sort of plot of the typical duration of the whole process, starting in for people who were screened and entered the process in May of 2025, and comparing them throughout the year to people who were screened in December. And you can see that it got substantially faster over that time. I'm going to speed up a little. I know I don't have a lot more time. So through this program and through our interviews, we identified some of the successful solutions to the common barriers I mentioned on the other slide. For application complexity, this in-person, one-on-one case management. For home retrofit requirements, increased funding, as Cliff alluded to, and then that upfront contractor assessment. To address distrust and misinformation, really meeting customers where they are through language, through having a trusted person sit down with people. For that energy bill uncertainty, doing some degree of upfront bill analysis. That's something that we heard from some of our utility interviewees, that providing customers with a customized analysis of their bills is really helpful. To address delays, this streamlining and relationship building that we're going to be talking about today. And similarly here for coordination challenges, additional relationship building, and really using the overlaps across different programs to our advantage. So we had 3 key sort of recommendation areas that came out of our study. One was to really invest in that case management approach, and especially to invest in that for lower income households in disadvantaged communities. This approach really allows the case manager to meet the customers where they are through that one-on-one interaction, to minimize customer burden, and to build these relationships across all of the different entities involved, which is super important and helpful. And then also, definitely very importantly, to involve and compensate members of the community to support that outreach. Second, we had a recommendation to develop an adaptable, modular, universal home assessment process with contractor vetting and program administrator buy-in. So that's a lot of words to essentially say this is not a one-size-fits-all situation. You need, if we're going to try to have a sort of universal assessment process that can help, make it more straightforward for a contractor to go into a home, say, here's what this home could, qualify for, here's what upgrades make sense for this home, and then use that assessment to actually apply for a bunch of different programs. It is something that our interviewees were really interested in, but it also is something that can't just be one size fit all, because every home is different. There are different types of homes, and even within any given type, there's a lot of, heterogeneity that makes it important for this to be really adaptable. So we put together a sort of very initial template of how this could look, but the most important thing is that it would be really really balanced between the idea of being universal and the idea of being adaptable to each situation. And finally, we also recommended starting to lay groundwork for aligning the processes for different programs. And that was something where I think there's a ton of sticking points. There are good reasons that these programs have different processes in place. And in some cases, maybe there are things that could change easily, but in many instances, there are things that can't just change at the drop of a hat. So rather than recommending some broad sweeping change to the programs, we're starting a teeny bit earlier on in the process to say, here is some of the groundwork to lay. Some of the programs, identifying programs that should be included and entities that need to be involved, because one of the biggest things we heard from people is people, and by people I mean all of these different entities, agencies, utilities, et cetera, they really need to be bought in to the process for it to work and matter. So sorry, that was a really lightning speed presentation of a pretty detailed report, but hope that gave you a bit of a sense of what we did. And I'm going to pass it back to Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And of course, there is a lot more to discuss, and you can read the full report, and we're happy to discuss that more here. We are going to broaden the conversation now, though, and I'll welcome the panelists that we've invited and have graciously agreed to participate in this panel discussion. Again, we'll have 25 to 30 minutes with the panel, and then please do continue to submit Q&A in the Q&A function of the webinar so that we can get to your all questions and comments a little bit later. So our panelists are, as you can see on the screen, Beckie Menten, who's the California Director of the Building Decarbonization Coalition, Ross Zelen, who's the Principal Consultant, the California Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change, and then Wendy Salvador-Galbraith, who is a community organizer and resident in South Los Angeles, working with Greenhouse, South LA. So the first question I want to ask each of you in turn, and I'll go to Wendy first, is a bit of a softball. Simply, could you share more about your role, how it relates to building electrification, and why you're passionate about this subject?
Hi, Greg. Thanks for the softball question. Pretty much, I think about over 10 years ago, my family and I made this huge decision. It was huge in our eyes to leave our huge minivan that I think it would cost, back then it was about almost $80 to fill up that minivan. Long story short, we invested in a Prius. And that small little car revolutionized our lives. We've been able to travel across the country. We've been able to do so many things because we were relieved from the burden of having to pay so much money at the gas pump. And so little by little, we started asking ourselves, what if we tried this or that? Of course, it evolved to home electrification. And it helped that my husband's an electrician. He also is a contractor, and he started Greenhouse South LA. I'm really passionate about bringing these savings to our community. South LA is the poorest, the youngest district in LA, in a community where we were, it was mainly 80% Black. Now it's 80% Latino. It's really important for me to be able to connect with my community and bridge that gap for our community. So I'm really passionate about the work that I do. I do it because I love being out with my family, with my friends. And I wouldn't recommend anything to my family and friends and my community if I didn't apply it in my life. So that's why I do what I do. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Next, we'll go to Beckie.
Thank you. It's a hard act to follow. As the California Director of Building Decarbonization Coalition, I mean, this is kind of my life. I have spent nearly 20 years working at the intersection of buildings and energy. I really think building electrification is super exciting to me because it has the potential to deliver on these triple bottom line solutions. We're not only addressing climate change, but we're investing in people's homes. We can improve health and comfort, we can improve affordability. More than 25% of Californians lack access to air conditioning. So this can be a solution to help people survive the increasing risks of extreme heat that we have here in California. And another thing that I think is really positive about this is it can put people to work. If we have to retrofit more than 13 million residential units alone across California, this can be a huge economic development driver as well. So I am really passionate about the opportunities we have here.
Great, thank you, Beckie. Ross?
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg. I think that for me, the reason why I come at the space of building decarbonization is that the area that the chair of my committee represents, Senator Henry Stern, and also the area I grew up in, dealt with in 2015 the largest natural gas leak in U.S. history in Aliso Canyon, and so that everybody knew people, right? There's 2 million people in the San Fernando Valley, but it's a fairly tight community. You're only 1 degree of separation from folks, and so even though when the leak happened, I was already invested in climate change, climate action. I saw the role of the green economy, just as Beckie mentioned, right? That this was going to be our generation's not just moral fight, but economic fight to really bring in a new and better and more inclusive and equitable economy. But building decarbonization became personal because it was the fact is that people got sick, people got cancer, people are no longer with us because we needed to store a gas in people's backyards that we didn't necessarily need it, right? If we had applied solutions around building decarbonization, if we had electrified people's homes, and if we weren't needing that gas to keep people warm, or run other appliances, we could have very easily been able to close that down. And so that's really where I've been very passionate about deploying resources. And then we can talk about it next is that between me and my work in the Senate with Senator Stern, who was the author of 1477, the bill that created a lot of the modern day building decarbonization program, the tech program that Beckie helps work on and deploy and administer, is how do we take this and how do we fight for more statewide resources in the space day to day.
Great. And I think I'll go right back to you to kind of help us understand how things are going at the state level. And your committee obviously works on policies relevant to home electrification. So the question is kind of, what's your blunt assessment on the progress of implementation and where we need to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna tell 2 different stories here. I'm gonna tell the story about our macro level climate programs and how building decarbonization fits in within that, and then I'm gonna tell the story of where bills are in the current process this year, and the implementation of other bills from previous year. And I'm gonna be brief because I bet my co-panelists will add a little bit of color. But the big issue when it comes to our budget and the macro level conversations we're having in the legislature is the fact that building decarbonization and home electrification has never really had a full-time appropriation. It's never had a kind of a rooted tree that knew was going to bear fruit every year, and it was always a fight. Every year was always a fight. We're going to have to go ask for money. We're going to have to scrounge. Did we have a surplus? Did we have a deficit? And so with that came some good years and some less good years. And so last year, when the state reauthorized the cap and trade, now called cap and invest program, there was a framework that was put into place by the leaders of both the Senate and the Assembly about what they'd like to spend money on. And building decarbonization didn't make that list. And that was very disappointing to my boss, to many other members in the legislature, that we were going to spend a lot of money on things, but not spend money on this thing that we know is such a critical climate solution. And as we talked about right before, a public health solution and a jobs program. And we knew at that point last year that the Inflation Reduction Act had been, was already repealed by the OBBA, which we can call the stupid bill, that killed a lot of the positive momentum that we were making on home electrification and getting homeowners into electrification technologies as part of the tax credit plan. And so as with that, we were disheartened, but we weren't done. We've continued to fight. And so I believe that in this next 2 to 3 month period, there'll be an opportunity to have a conversation about what that funding plan actually looks like again. And then into the new administration with our next governor, then I think there's going to be some opportunities for holistic conversations about how we fund what we call energy efficiency programs, ratepayer programs, general fund programs, and try to find a home for consistent funding for home electrification. On the bill front, I'm just going to mention 2 bills. One, I'm going to be very brief because it's my own bill, and I'm going to work on it with Beckie, is a bill called SB 1359, which is a bill by Senator Stern, which is looking at essentially the role of the gas distribution infrastructure system. And I think that's a really important bill because we have to stop spending more money and building the gas system out before so we can actually take a stock to make sure that this is the important thing, I think, especially because we're talking about the pilot in the gateway cities, is that there's the upper middle class and upper income folks will have choices, right? And they don't look at their gas bill or the electricity bill as a major burden, right? They're not dealing with being in arrears. They're not dealing with making hard choices about whether to put food on the table, gas or electricity in the car tank, or paying a bill. And so as folks adopt technologies like heat pumps and electric appliances, if we don't get the gas system figured out and have a real statewide strategic plan about how the decommissioning is going to go, who's going to end up paying the brunt of it? It's going to be renters, and it's going to be poor people who don't have the opportunity to decarbonize, who don't get to make those decisions, right? More than 50% of Californians are renters, and I'm one of them, and we don't get to make decisions about what appliances we have in our houses. And so I think that's a key thing. The other bill is AB 2313 by Assemblymember Mark Berman, who's been a great champion on this topic. And that's going to be all about the idea of looking at electrification alternatives whenever projects are being proposed. And really, when we think about this, the best analogy I will say is that when the Altadena and the Palisades fires happened, we never took that moment to pause and say, wait a second, should we rebuild the gas distribution infrastructure in these two communities, or should we pause and say maybe we can get the majority of the community to say we want to go all electric? And so obviously for those two communities, the gas distribution system has already been fixed. They already spent all their money in it. The gas company will make their returns. They'll recover all their costs. But when the next bad thing happens, we want to be prepared. And so those are the two bills that I would like to shout out. I'll pause there.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. And I'm sure we'll get more or into those particular bills more in policies and programs. I think I'll turn it back to Wendy, though, to get a different perspective and just kind of ask, in your experience and your work, what are community members most excited about in terms of building electrification, as well as what are their top concerns, and particularly how can we address issues like are faced by renters in the space to be able to actually support people to make this transition?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that, like Ross said, specifically in our community, number one, we're in South LA. I just gave you some information about South LA. We have about 20% homeowners and 80% renters. And we have a huge issue with gentrification, specifically in our area. And so what happens is that when we are out there engaging with the community, everyone's excited about, wow, we get to save money. It's new technology, all the amazing things about home electrification. However, when we are talking to I would say the bigger organizations, people in power, whatever it may be, there's a huge concern about gentrification, about our community being displaced due to the green economy, the electrification, home electrification. And like I said, 80% of our community are renters. So a lot of it, the minute we start hearing about rebates and incentives, they're completely disconnected because most likely those incentives won't reach them. So that's the good side and the bad side. The flip side is that as we share with our community, we realize, just like I told you earlier, we had to make a small change in our household and in our family, and it just really made a huge difference in our pocketbook. So when we go in with our community, when we go in talking about the savings, about energy efficiency, about how it's, one of the little things that we use at the greenhouse is when we're having home electrification workshops, we turn on a smoke machine. And I know it's silly, but this is what we do with the community. And everyone starts freaking out, like, oh my goodness, what is that? And so we're pretty much explaining these are the gases that are released. This is what causes asthma. This is what causes cancer. And it's until then that the parents and the mothers and everyone starts realizing, no, we do have to make a change. This is not okay. And so I give a shout out to all the people in power, politicians that are really, really, truly fighting for our community. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, everyone, for allowing us to just be here. And like I said, it's a challenge, but it is something necessary for us to talk about and always have a space at the table for frontline communities like ours. And yeah, that's what we're excited about, being at the table.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. And yeah, I appreciate like those experiences and yeah, the need for frontline communities to be at the table. I want to turn it over to Beckie. Speaking of sort of challenges, ask about the topic of affordability as it relates to building electrification. Of course, affordability is in the air everywhere. Everyone's for affordability. There's some confusion there, but I think when we talk about building electrification and affordability, I guess, could you highlight both the challenges for us as well as where you see a path forward, whether that's supported by specific policies that exist now or pending legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. And as much as I would love to start by flipping that on its head and saying, we really can't afford to not do these things, I also recognize that the ability of someone to manage increasing energy costs on a day-to-day basis is a real challenge. And so it is unfortunate that in spite of the fact that a heat pump can be as much as 3 times more efficient than a gas furnace due to the rapidly rising electricity rates here in California, we know that affordability can still be a challenge. The good news is we know these projects can still save money, especially if you are someone who has an existing inefficient air conditioning unit. Maybe you're finding that you're actually not able to operate your air conditioning unit in order to provide a quality of life because of the cost of running that. You're an excellent candidate for a heat pump. You're a customer who could save hundreds annually on your bills. I would also note that there are some rate reforms that have come and are continuing to come out of the Public Utilities Commission. Recently, we had the base services charge launch for customers who are on CARE and FARA rates, which are income qualified rate plans. We expect that those will save significant amounts of money for customers when it comes to operating all electric homes. So that's great news. Thanks to Ross and others in the legislature last year, one of the things I am excited to have seen come out of the legislative package last year is really a focus on taking some of those greenhouse gas investment funds and directing those towards reducing electricity rates through both a restructure and an increase on the climate credit. So that could come over years. There was also some great reforms around reducing transmission costs that will take longer to show up for customers, but are in the works. The Public Utilities Commission has also recently launched a new proceeding on advanced electric rate design, which will, among other things, be looking at how we can better structure rates to provide these operational cost savings for customers who have all electric homes. While we're on the topic, I do want to note that building electrification is really fantastic for long-term system affordability. It's a way to sort of offset our high fixed system costs with increased revenue. We know that those additional revenues generated from building electrification also take advantage of when energy is cheap, when energy is clean. So overall, from a system perspective, the more buildings we electrify, the more stability we have in the costs and operation of our system, which helps balance and stabilize rates over the long term. Simultaneously, we expect the gas system, as Ross had mentioned, to get more and more expensive over time. As it is now, currently 2/3 of gas bills across the country, and this is the same here in California, don't actually go to pay for the commodity of natural gas. They go to pay for the infrastructure of natural gas. You are paying for pipelines, you are paying for the updating, maintenance, repair of those pipelines. Those are costs that you as a gas ratepayer will be stuck with for 50 years, plus the cost of capitalization. So really, electrification can also offer a hedge. This is why, as Ross mentioned, it's also really important to make sure that we're creating opportunities for customers who may lack access to either capital or decision-making authority over their appliances to really be some of the first to receive the benefits as we do more and more electrification-based programs.
Great. Thank you, Becky. And yeah, a lot of challenges and reforms ahead just in the the utility and electrification space that are needed. I want to turn now, I think, two final questions. One we'll do rapid fire at the end, but I'll open this one up to anyone who wants to jump in. Basically around what do you, our report and our analysis focus quite a bit on universal home assessment. What do you think of the feasible paths forward for universal home assessment, as well as what Cliff mentioned at the outset, the ever mentioned but ever elusive one-stop shop for incentives? So just welcome perspectives from many of you on kind of either of those topics.
Well, I'm gonna happy to go first because I think I'm gonna be the shortest because I don't do the work on the ground like Wendy and Becky do. But this is what I will say is that right now we're getting ready to release $40 million for an out of the Aliso Canyon settlement for what will start as the San Fernando Valley, but eventually might open. Hopefully, we're going to get it all subscribed in the San Fernando Valley very quickly, but it might open to the whole region, the whole Southern California region, for building decarbonization. And what we've spent a lot of time doing with Beckie's help and other organizations in the San Fernando Valley is trying to get everybody organized. So maybe it's not exactly the one-stop shop approach that we still have, most of our folks will be in LADWP territory. They have their own process. They have their own, especially when it comes to multifamily units, they've got their own initiatives. But what we are trying to do is we are trying to break down these silos and talk to each other before the first dollars become available, because we know that whether it's a single family homeowner, a renter, or a multifamily building owner, you need to come organized and correct, because you get them once, and it's going to take probably 2, 3, 4 touches to make sure you convince them. Wendy can speak probably at length to that, of having to work with her community and build that trust. But we know that if our first interaction with a resident, with a regular old person, says, oh, and here's the 5 or 6 different people you need to talk to, you've already turned a good chunk of our folks off. And people are busy. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? People are just busy. They care, they're passionate, but we need to make it very simple for them. And then I will say the other thing is that one of the things I really loved about what the Gateway Cities project did, and what we all talked about in your report, is doing that pre-work, right? Sending the contractors into the community to build trust, because we have this in our district. It's happened throughout California, but especially in urban areas, especially in mixed income areas, where you have folks who have done generations of wiring and they've done work themselves and they've brought in their friends, and not everything is always up to code. And so we have to build that trust with folks to say, it's okay. Like, you're not going to get in trouble. We're here to help. Which I think if you talk to the average person, they're immediately, whether it's for other purposes or not other purposes, they're immediately a little skittish when somebody from the government says, I want to take a look at, your wiring, your, anything having to do with your infrastructure on your property. So that's the big thing. I really appreciated that the Gateway Cities COG and the community partners, the folks right on the ground, did that work, and we have a lot of lessons out of it.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. And Becky, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I started working here at BDC on policy, I spent about 15 years in the program implementation space, and this elusive one-stop shop model has been a vision for a long time. I want to give a shout out to Ruth Ann Norton with the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative. One of the problems that we face in the buildings movement, particularly when you're seeking to support historically underserved communities, is that there's a lot of need. Not all of that need is associated with energy outcomes. We see homes that need sometimes significant remediation before you can even address the HVAC system. And this means fundamentally, that leveraging funds across multiple program sources is not only a best practice, in some cases, it's really necessary to deliver the positive outcomes you're hoping for from homeowners when it comes to health, safety, other program sources. But the challenge here is that each of these programs comes with their own program requirements. It's a lengthy and administratively burdensome process to try to figure out how to knit everything together. And that's either handled by the homeowner or the contractor on behalf of the homeowner or the home occupant. So I do think wherever we can find those streamlined processes to help ensure that we're maximizing the benefits when we have the attention and engagement of that home occupant, it's really critical to do so. I think what Ross has spearheaded in the case of the Aliso Canyon settlement funding is exactly right. You know, you really need to start at the beginning. You really need to bring in the program stakeholders that you're planning to be working with in that ecosystem. And before you launch that program, you need to figure out how you're going to work together to make it as easy and as least burdensome as possible for the folks who are hoping to participate.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. Do you have anything to add on this, Wendy?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that it's really important to take into consideration the culture of our community. When you start talking about contractors, I personally, to be quite honest with you, there's not a lot of HVAC systems here in our area, and a lot of our community prides itself on saying, "Oh, I don't need a HVAC system. Oh, I'm good." Oh, and really, with all these heat waves, we keep telling them you need something, especially for our legacy families. And so, what I would say to that is, when you start approaching these programs with terminology like concierge, uh, um, contractor, already I'll tell you, that's a huge red flag. When you talk about a contractor, guess what comes behind a contractor? An inspector. My husband's a contractor. He's an electrical, he's a master electrician, and I don't want inspectors in my house. That's the way we were brought up. That's how we're raised. We don't want inspectors in our house. So it's really important to have that trust in our community. But what I will tell you is the work that you all are doing is really important because I've had the opportunity to work with Tom Knox. And to me, in our community, people don't know Tom, but they know what he's done in our community. There's like, if you drive on our block with our youth who are training to be future electrical engineers, maintenance installers, all this other amazing stuff that my husband's doing with them, most of the youth's parents drive electric cars because of programs that were implemented by ValleyCam. And I think that's what's important to know, that although there's a lot of tweaking to do with these programs, number one, if you're talking to our community, show pictures of our community. If you're talking to our community, bring the people from the community, because we don't trust outsiders. That's the bottom line. If you go onto the websites, which I've done, and you start looking for a contractor for my zip code, there's probably about 5 contractors that work with the tech program. Out of those 5 contractors, one is in Pasadena, one is in Cypress. I don't even know where Cypress is. And I bet you anything, the guy from Pasadena that comes out here is not going to be looking out for me or for my community. So it's important for us to take all this into consideration, because if we are going to meet those goals, 6 million heat pumps by 2030, you can't do it without frontline communities. You can't do it without Black and brown people. And I'm telling you right now, the work that's being done here in our community, it's really important, because all it takes is one family to implement whatever it is we're trying to show them, whatever it is we're trying to bring them onto, because then that family tells the tios and the tias and the cousins and the uncles, and that's how the word gets spread. It's not so much these big programs, it's having the right person. And again, I'm going to give a shout out to Tom and Richard at Redeemer, because they're bold enough to just say, you know what, let's go out and let's do it. And it really is a huge help. A huge help. And another thing I will close with, our community is seeing the politicians that are backing up these programs, and our communities are saying, who is backing up these programs, because that's who we're going to vote for. And that's something that we're learning as we work with these programs. People want to see who is backing them up, who is advocating for them. And it's important to know that our community is watching. And again, thank you for the privilege and the honor to be here with you all.
Of course. Thank you, Wendy. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Lauren to, I guess, open up the floor further to questions that have been submitted in the Q&A function. This could be questions to anyone on the panel. So we'll go ahead and I'll let Lauren jump in with those questions.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you all so much for an excellent discussion. I'm really glad you're all were able to join us. So I'll start with a question that I think is sort of nicely tied into the conversation we were just having, which is about the topic of aligning application processes and how programs often have their own unchangeable funding-related requirements that make it hard to just simplify to support streamlining. What ideas does the group have on how to navigate this and make our programs go further? Should direct install programs all be comprehensive electrification on their own, or should they be trying to stack a bunch of individual appliance incentives and just fill the gaps?
So again, as the former program person, happy to sort of take a stab at this. And again, I really just want to point to the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative as a place that I think has really approached this with a really interesting perspective. I mean, it started in Baltimore, Maryland, and they were recognizing that when they went into homes for energy efficiency purposes, they realized that those homes likely also qualified for lead mitigation programs, they qualified for asthma mitigation programs, and that the homeowner, the home occupant, would have to go apply for each of those separately before they could actually get access to all of that funding. And so they started to innovate on a model of how can we help these different programs actually come together and talk and figure out how we can work together so that one customer intake form can really be shared and spread across these different programs. We can get our funding to work together. We can get our contractors to work together. It's a lot of work. I'm not going to try to say that this is an easy thing to do, because Megan, as you well know, this is absolutely something where all of these different programs have these like funder requirements that you have to meet. But if you do that work at the onset and you really try to get these programs working together, then you can get to a place where you can help sort of co-refer. You can bring funds that go to the same installer. You can really help to like make it as easy as possible to get the maximum amount of resources. So that, in my opinion, is really the best way to do it. Like, start at the beginning.
Ross or Wendy, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add very briefly that, one of the programs that we haven't talked about today, and I think is very applicable to some parts of our Gateway Cities COG and some parts of LA, is the Equitable Building Decarb program, which is trying to do the direct install, a little bit more of the one-stop shop. And so our friends at SoCalRen and LA County are going to administer a lot of that. I'm not 100% certain, so I'll give me a little grace on if there's other folks involved, but I know that they're a central player in getting that program out. And that's one of those programs that doesn't require having to go talk to 5 or 6 different relevant agencies and your utility, and that's just meant to come in and say we're doing the full thing. But I think it's mostly going to go to multifamily. I'm going to look to Beckie to make sure that I'm not wrong. It's a portion. Portion's going to go to both, but I think that to me is like there's going to be a lot of lessons to be learned out of how SoCalRen administers EBD, the Equitable Building Decarb program, and then I think the other thing is that one of the what I want to also note is that like we will have good times again in the state budget, and fingers crossed and everything crossed that we're going to have a change in federal administration in 2029, and that federal spigot will come back, because and then things like this, things like the Gateway Cities project, things like these reports will help inform us so that we do a better job of getting the dollars out faster, because that was one of the biggest criticisms with the Inflation Reduction Act, that it took too long, but we'll still do it with that high integrity, high rigor, low ability to game the system, low ability for people to be scammed, especially in working class communities. We'll find that balance, but that I think that's the thing about like finding that one-stop shop that kind of balances those competing interests.
I think if I had to add anything to this, it would be that um, it's a huge process. I wish I could say that a one-stop shop is the right tool, the right answer. Again, speaking from experience, this transition has taken my family and I at least 15 years. 15 years to just even dare to think differently, to even dare to think, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to invest my money in something I know nothing about. And that's what we're asking our community to do, to change their lifestyles, to invest thousands of dollars when most of our community is barely making it. And so when we think about a one-stop shop, what we do in our community at the greenhouse is we tell them change one thing. Learn about energy efficiency, learn about time of rate usage, right? Learn about how if you use LED bulbs, just small steps, because when the community sees that, then they're able to take on something bigger. And so to me, the one-stop shop, it sounds like a great idea, but really, truly, it's going to take years. And so our job for us at Greenhouse South LA, again, this is a grassroots org. And what we do is we tell people, hey, listen, we're committed. We don't only have them sign, oh, do you commit to cutting this or doing that? We tell them we commit to that when there are incentives and when there are rebates, we commit to bring them to you, to the people that we're working with. And so it's a relationship. We're not just extracting from our community, because our community already is used to that. We're tired of people coming into frontline communities, disadvantaged communities, and extracting from us. And so what we do is we say we're committed to helping you through the process. It's not going to happen in a year. It's not going to happen in 2 years. It's not going to happen because the incentives aren't there. They're not there. The rebates are not there. And so that's all I would say. Change the way you think about our community. When you're talking about community engagement, just, I mean, again, don't use those words. Don't sit behind a table and have our community fill out an application. We're asking for Social Security, for this, for that, and that's not a relationship. When we talk with our community, they're sitting right here next to us. When we're talking to them, it's on the weekends, it's on Mother's Day, it's late at night, it's when everyone's done working, and guess what? That's the only time. So when you're talking about community engagement, a little flyer sitting behind a table saying, oh, can you fill out and give me your information, and I'm going to introduce you to a concierge contractor, that doesn't work anymore. And so that's all I would say. It's like, it's a good idea, but in the same way that I dare to come and sit with you all, which is very intimidating, I challenge you all to go out to our community and see what it's like. Everything looks great on paper, but once you step out on those streets, a year ago, we were having to face ICE kidnapping our community, and the streets were empty. I just want to brag about my community, how resilient it is. And now when you walk out those streets, you have people in jerseys for Mexico because they just want. That's our community. You can't put that on paper. You cannot introduce a contractor and expect for them to sign over whatever it is. I mean, again, all the work that you all are doing, amazing. I want to learn more about it. But I also invite you to come out to our community and to learn more about our community. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you so much, all of you. And we're out of time. We have a few more questions in the Q&A, so we may be able to circulate some responses to those after the webinar, but I'll pass it to Greg to close this out for now.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone and help us end promptly. I want to thank Amaya for being in the background, helping us put on this webinar. I want to thank all of the panelists and speakers, including Cliff, for sharing their perspectives and for doing work in this space in the long term and being committed to it. And then I want to thank everyone for joining. Remind you again that we'll try to answer the questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, but this webinar is recorded. It'll be on our website. We and others at UCLA and the UC system are trying to do work in the space to help advance solutions. And just, yeah, thank you all in advance for helping us actually make this transition as difficult as it is and leading to the carbon-free and equitable future that we all want. So with that, also have a good afternoon. Thanks for joining.